In Bürgenstock, Switzerland today, there is a peace conference that has just started. It's going to be going today and tomorrow to try and find some way to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Or at least that's what it says on the surface of it. I mean, it's for a peace settlement. It's called a peace conference. But when you look underneath the surface here, strange things seem to come up. And we've got a really great guest to help us unpack some of this today, who's from Switzerland. And we have Colonel Jacques Baud back. He was on our show a couple of days ago talking on some of the issues of the war. But there's no better person to have to talk about this on this topic. And we're really grateful to have you back again today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back to the show. Thank you.
And it's always good. I mean, you always have such great insight here, and you seem to always have stuff to show that most of our audience doesn't even know about. And I can't imagine that's going to be the case again today here. But I want to kind of set the stage for what we're going to discuss here, because this is the strangest peace conference that's with that title I've ever seen in my life. Because ordinarily one would think, if you've got a conflict and you've got side A and side B, and you want to have a negotiated settlement to end it, and a just peace, which is a phrase I've heard, you would think you would have the two sides sitting there and potentially some other sides as well. But as we'll see in this following clip here, that's not the case here. Watch this.
A peace summit launched by Ukraine looks in trouble even before it's begun. President Volodymyr Zelensky has asked global leaders to attend the talks in Switzerland in June, but without much success so far. You see, the US President, Joe Biden, is planning to skip the gathering. Russia hasn't even been invited, and the leaders of China, India and Brazil may not turn up. That's left EU ministers scrambling to find a solution. With Israel's war raging in Gaza and Russian and Ukrainian troops locked in what looks like a near stalemate, Kyiv is desperate to keep world attention on the conflict at home. What can it hope to achieve if Moscow isn't there?
Indeed, if the other half of the party's not there, one's got to wonder, what are you even trying to accomplish? As best as you understand, what is the purpose, the actual purpose of this so-called peace summit?
Well, it's even more bizarre, because if you look at it, this is the seventh conference on exactly the same topic with the same participants. And we see that there was this, in fact, this is the seventh time that Zelensky presents his so-called 10-point formula. It started as a 5-point formula that it was presented to the UN General Assembly in September 2022. Later, it was developed into a 10 points plan, but basically it's exactly the same points. And it was presented in the G20, then in Copenhagen and so on. And each time it's ended as a failure, basically, because again, for exactly the same reason, you have only one participant. Basically, you had only Western countries attending the conference, and of course, everybody applauded to Zelensky, and that was it. But this didn't help to solve any question, and didn't address any of the realities on the ground. If you look at the points, in fact, you can see that probably I presented that on this channel, I don't remember, but in any case, these are in essence the 10 points that are developed in this peace formula. I don't want to go each of the point. It's sufficient to say that almost each of these points are based on a resolution of the UN. So as to radiation and nuclear safety, that was a resolution taken after the issue on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in summer 2022. Food security, that was a resolution that was taken after the issue of the circulation on the Black Sea also in summer 2022, and so on and so forth. So basically, we have 10 points. But the interesting point here is that it addresses the withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities. So basically, it's a plan that provides for the capitulation of Russia. And we have to probably to understand that, because it's totally disconnected from the reality on the ground. But the explanation of that is that this plan was first designed before the so-called summer offensive that we had in summer 2023. And it was expected, at least on the Ukrainian side and probably on the Western side as well, that this counteroffensive would lead to the disruption of the Russian forces in Ukraine and eventually leads to victory. And that, on this basis, this plan or this formula was designed. As a result, in that context, with the anticipation of a success, then you can understand the setup of the setting of this plan. The problem is that, as we know today, the counteroffensive was never successful at no point in time and didn't bring any success. In fact, at the end of the counteroffensive, even as it was reported by the New York Times, the Russians gained more territory than the Ukrainians. So basically, absolutely no success. The problem is that Zelensky kept exactly the same plan. And he presented this plan in Malta last year. And the Swiss government offered to discuss the plan once again.
Yeah, now I actually wanted to ask you about that, because I cannot understand, why would the Swiss government want to put their name and their credibility and their reputation that they've got for decades, even centuries really, of being a peacemaking kind of entity, but there's something that can't lead to peace. Why did they agree to do this when they knew it wasn't going to include Russia?
Well, thank you for asking the question. And even though I'm Swiss, I'm not able to answer it. This is totally irrational.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people in the Swiss, including the Swiss military, don't understand what is the purpose of all that. And even don't understand the stance of the Swiss government, because remember that in 2022, Switzerland was one of the first countries to apply sanctions on Russia. And for a while, up to October 2022, Switzerland was even the country that sanctioned more Russia, even more than the US, even more than the EU.
Didn't know that.
So it's absolutely incredible. Today, as of today, the last figures of June 2024, Switzerland is the third most sanctioning country over Russia, even more than the EU, even more than Canada or Australia. No, not Canada. I think Australia, and probably more than the UK, and more than Japan, and so on. So this is totally incomprehensible from a Swiss point of view, because Switzerland has always managed to be neutral. And as you know, neutrality was even imposed to Switzerland in the early 19th century. And since it was imposed by the so-called big powers, or great powers, as they were called at that time, like France, Germany, Italy at that time, and this neutrality was considered as recognized or acknowledged by everybody. And that's the reason why this neutrality was never violated during World War I and World War II. But somehow, and even during the Cold War, we managed to be neutral, even if we were closer to the West than the East, for obvious reasons. But in any case, we managed to keep this neutrality. And today, with this conflict in Ukraine, everything has been thrown overboard, and the neutrality basically doesn't exist anymore. And as the Ukrainian government, by the way, asked Switzerland to represent their interests in Russia, because we have an embassy in Moscow, of course, and the Ukraine and Switzerland asked to be acknowledged to be representing the Ukrainian interest in Moscow. The Russian foreign ministry refused. to say, well, why should we accept that you represent Ukrainian interests? You are supposed to be neutral, and we
And so,
don't
what is
recognize.
what are they saying on the Swiss media? What are the Swiss leaders saying? Because I mean, that is such a departure from what historically has been the case in Switzerland. What do they claim is the reason why they're going to this antagonistic view towards Russia now?
Well, we have exactly the same thing that you have in the rest of Europe, basically. We have a center-left government that is for the human rights, the rule-based international order, no longer the law-based international order, by the way. That's a very important change for
Yeah.
Swiss foreign policy. But in any case, that's the situation as of today. And this, in fact, this is their way of fighting dictatorship somehow. Although we used to mediate between, for instance, Iran and the U.S., Switzerland still represents U.S. interests in Tehran while representing Iranian interests in Washington, D.C. We did the same with Cuba at the time. So at that time, we didn't ask this question whether the Iranian government was democratic or not. We were just mediating, period. And that's the role of a neutral country. You don't start to judge the parties.
I see. That's fascinating.
You're just being in between, and that's how it happened, and it's still so between Iran and the U.S. By the way, all the discussion we had recently between with Iran being involved in the Middle East, all this went through the Swiss embassy, because we still represent both interests on both directions. In Cuba, these things have changed since. The Obama administration decided to reestablish diplomatic relationships with Cuba. As a result, now the U.S. has an embassy in Havana, and therefore the Switzerland doesn't represent anymore the interests of both sides. But basically, that was how it worked, and.
Okay.
And that's what we dropped with Ukraine, because we tried to have no longer a political stance, but a moral stance towards Russia.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'd never heard about that. So that's what the view is within Switzerland. Now, when we back out to the European section again and to Ukraine, they're going to try to put some, like what I call put lipstick on a pig, to try to make something that's ridiculous on the surface to try and look good, but it just doesn't come off very well. Here's Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister for the European Union, trying to make this sound like a good idea.
The purpose of this conference is to bring as many people as possible to discuss about how peace could look like. It's not a peace conference because Russia, the aggressor, will not be there. But the rest of the world have to understand the concerns of Ukraine. And this country wants to explain to the rest of the world what's happening and which are their proposals to stop the war. And the more people will go at the highest possible level, the more the international community could use their influence and their capacity to stop this war.
Okay, I think everybody pretty much knows by now what's going on there and what the needs are. So this is not going to help put that forward anymore. But that's what Borrell's trying to tell everybody.
Well, the thing is that everybody understands that this conference will not achieve the initial objective. As a result, even Zelensky started, and that was probably the result of the discussion between Blinken and Zelensky in Kiev before the last couple of weeks. Because today we see, I showed before the different points of the peace formula, and now it seems that only three points have been kept for this discussion, and all the rest has been dropped because obviously they will not able to achieve any result on that. And you see that the 3 points that are kept are extremely basic, and probably even they could be accepted by Russia if Russia would be involved. But I think this is just a way of trying to rescue the plan, because my personal view, and I'm not the only one to think, that the real purpose of this conference is no longer to achieve anything, because the Russians, as they said, and rightly so, by the way, they said that, well, why should we talk peace without us? So if you want to talk peace, then we should be involved in that. That's also the position of the Chinese, by the way, and that makes a lot of sense. But I think this, even though 3 points will not bring much, in fact, to the discussion.
Yeah.
But the real point.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the real point, I think, behind all this is to, let's say, to confirm the legitimacy of Zelensky. When we see, as I said, this is the 7th time that the conference is dealing with exactly the same topics, exactly the same one. The 10 points plan has been addressed 7 times. But this time we see that the Kiev government is putting a lot of attention on that, and a lot of effort to make this conference a success. And
in fact, here's what one of the Ukrainian ambassadors, to bolster your point there, when asked by a South African television station, why are you having this conference without Vladimir Putin in there? Now, notice in her answer, she actually doesn't answer that question. Check this out.
Ambassador, quite an important peace summit, but the thorny issue is the absence of Russia, because you can't have peace when the other side is not part of this. What's the rationale behind leaving out Russia?
Absolutely agree with you. There cannot be peace if one side of the conflict doesn't want peace. And then you and your people who are suffering have to think how we can bring this peace into the country. That is so crucial for the global stability and the sustainable development. So this is the attempt. This is the yet another attempt to bring different actors, make it very inclusive as much as it's possible, to express the views of each sovereign and independent country, how we can achieve peace in Ukraine.
So her premise there was, we want to bring all these people to get views, which, as you pointed out, they've already done that very, very thoroughly. But then the second thing is she claimed that Russia doesn't want to have peace. Now, that is not supported by the Russian side, which actually says they would be happy to have a negotiation if they were invited.
Yes, I think that was the Russian position since the very beginning. By the way, let's remember that Russia pushed the idea of having the discussion based on the Minsk agreement. They were the ones pushing for diplomatic solution to the conflict since the very beginning.
Even before the war.
Even before the war, exactly. So meaning that, in fact, it's a Western side who didn't want any negotiation with Russia. And by the way, a lot of people have said we cannot talk to a dictator. Even Biden said that. It's a dictator, so we don't talk to him, period. So, which is totally absurd. Remember that we had with Nixon, they talked to the Chinese in the 70s, and you had the strategic limitation talks between Reagan and Gorbachev. So what's the point of starting to make judgment on individuals? Well, if you want to talk peace, you talk peace. You are not talking about if you have a red hair or blue hair, or this is not this is not the question. So the thing is that, again, the whole conflict came out of the idea that Russia was weak and would be defeated extremely quickly through the sanctions. And the West still is with this idea. The problem is that the reality of the field has shown that it doesn't work that way. But the problem is that how can you go out of such a strategy without losing face? And that's exactly the problem of the West. But the thing is today, I think that the problem of the Ukrainians is not so much to achieve peace, because they know this conference will not achieve anything, but the problem is to confirm or reaffirm the legitimacy of Zelensky. I think
Well,
this is
and toward that end, I guess talking about something you've mentioned several times here already about the number of points here, but Zelensky himself wants to make sure he's seen on camera saying so.
At the first summit, we will address 3 points of the peace formula: nuclear security, food security, and the release of prisoners of war. And of course, the Ukrainian children abducted by Russia.
So he wants to add that kind of a fourth one in there, an emotional issue, at least according to much in the West and in Ukrainian media. It's obviously disputed on the Russian side here, but he just wants to be seen out front saying it. But I part of me understands why he would want to say that, but part of me doesn't, because I don't know how you benefit by having your name attached to something that's not going to succeed, that can't succeed, and actually ending the war or doing anything for your side.
Well, but remember that the legitimacy of Zelensky today, since he has canceled the presidential elections, and that according to the legal situation in Ukraine, constitution and all that, his position at this stage is probably not legitimate and even probably not legal. As a result, he needs to confirm this legitimacy towards the rest of the world, because that's the problem. I mean, and in fact, you have more and more countries that have adopted the rationale of the Russians, who said, well, by canceling the presidential election, Zelensky canceled also its own legitimacy as leader of Ukraine. So this is probably for him the main objective of this conference, because again, with 3 points, the 3 points I mentioned, or the 10 points, basically those points have been discussed 7 times. So we know that this will lead nowhere. The kids that have been so-called abducted, a U.S. journalist, by the way, found them in Russia. These guys are not abducted. These kids have been removed from the battlefield area. I mean, the area from the Donetsk and Lugansk area, where they were bombed every day by Ukrainian artillery, and on request of their parents, they were taken to Russia mainland, and they are trained. And a U.S. journalist, I think it's that was reported by the Gray Zone. You may find this a very good article on that, and. Okay. Showing that these kids are now doing music. They are located in hotels, in very nice places, and they are attending school, and they live like normal kids. It's absolutely not abduction. Some have returned to their parents since the Russian forces have moved forward in the Donbass, and some others are probably still in Russia. So this is absolutely not an abduction. These kids were just removed from dangerous area, and they were endangered by Ukrainian artillery and shelling especially in the Donetsk area. So here we are playing with words, and we are using it's just a political show from on the part of Zelensky. Yeah. And we know that this will add nothing to the discussion. The very importance for Zelensky is to be acknowledged as the leader of Ukraine, and I think that's the purpose of this conference at this stage.
Well, I guess from a certain perspective, you can say, okay, well, at least there's something that has some plausibility, even if it's not really wise. At least there's some thought given into it. But that's not carrying a lot of weight on the Russian side of this, because Vladimir Putin. Well, I'll just let him speak for himself. Here's his comments on this peace conference.
Провести какую-то конференцию в Швейцарии. Нас туда не приглашают. Более того, считают, что нам там делать нечего. Но и в то же время говорят, что и без нас ничего решить невозможно. А поскольку мы туда не едем, это уже вообще паноптикум какой-то. Говорят, что мы отказываемся от переговоров. Нас не приглашают. Говорят, что мы отказываемся. Но было бы смешно, если бы не было так грустно. Но еще раз хочу подчеркнуть, что мы за. Но только не в формате навязывания нам каких бы то ни было схем, которые ничего не имеют общего с действительностью.
So Putin actually said again, I want to say about a month ago, reiterated that he is willing to enter into negotiations, that he does want to have an end to the war as long as it's based on an objective reality of what's actually happening on the ground. And that is the part that so far neither Ukraine nor anybody in the West is willing to entertain. They just don't want to do that.
Yes, we have to understand that, as I said before, the Russian establishment, leadership, has always said they were in favor of negotiation. That was said by Vladimir Putin on several occasions, including with Tucker Carlson and all that, so we know that. And we have, by the way, if you look at the polls in Russia, you have about 55%, roughly 55% of the population who is in favor of negotiating. But at the same time, 75% of the Russian population supports the military operation. So meaning that the Russian population is exactly on the same line as the leadership. They are doing a war for just cause. Basically, it's about protecting the population of Donbass. And the majority of the population in Russia supports this idea. But at the same time, they said, if we come to the option of negotiating, then we would favor the option of negotiating.
That's fascinating. I had not seen those polls, but that is completely underscores something that John Mearsheimer said earlier on our show this week, something that's not commonly understood among the West, which perfectly matches what you just said here. Check out what he said.
I am not sure the Russians have an interest in shutting the war down anytime soon. The Russians now have the upper hand. I think the Ukrainian army is suffering greatly on the battlefield. And I think it's only a matter of time before the Russians push the Ukrainians back in a serious way and capture more territory. And I would think from a Russian point of view, it would be desirable to conquer a lot more territory than they now control, to position themselves for the future, because the Russians cannot be sure that Ukraine and the West, even if there is a ceasefire or some sort of settlement, will be content with that settlement and won't go back on the offensive sometime in the future. So if you're playing Russia's hand and you don't trust the West, you don't trust the Ukrainians, and you think that after a ceasefire is put in place, it may again turn into a hot war, you then have a vested interest in taking as much territory as possible now when you're strong and making sure that Ukraine is a truly dysfunctional rump state.
It's so ironic that everybody in the West always talks about how it's Putin that you can't trust. He's never kept his word. This is the view here. But as Mearsheimer said, and I think that it's one of the big failures of the Western side, is that we never look at it from the other person's perspective. Even if you disagree with them, you have to at least understand how they're thinking. And I think that what John talked about there, based on the polling information that you just cited and what Putin himself has said, you see a consistent pattern that because they don't trust us, they're going to probably want to accomplish things with a combination of military and then diplomacy once they get what they want.
Absolutely. I fully concur with what John Mearsheimer is saying. And if you look at the polls, basically, I have the figure here, the chart, where you see the different, this is the losses in May 2024, that shows that you have roughly 50%. It has decreased a little bit, the idea of the willingness of negotiation. You have, on the other hand, the willingness to continue the military operation has increased a little bit. So today you have 50% who would agree with negotiations, but you see it has decreased a little bit from 57% later last year, and it has the idea of continuing the military operation has increased a little bit. But basically, a majority of the population still would favor negotiation if the opportunity continues and happens. And if you look at the support to the military operation, that's the approval rate of the special military operation. All these figures are the figures from the Levada Center, which is a poll center in Russia, which is considered by the Russian authorities as a foreign agent. So it's absolutely not related to the government. But here we see clearly that you have now about 80% of the population who approves the special military operation, and only 15% who disapprove the conduct of this operation. So you have this kind of half contradiction, that you have on one hand a majority of the population who would agree to negotiation in case this opportunity comes up, but at the same time they are fully on the same line with Vladimir Putin in supporting the military operation. So
Wow.
we have this it's some kind of contradiction, but if you think about it, it's exactly the position of Vladimir Putin, in fact. And you can see that also comes in line with this idea that the approval rate of Vladimir Putin is extremely high, because you see that Vladimir Putin, in fact, reflects the same position of the Russian population. So Mersheimer is absolutely right. At this stage, the whole purpose of the absence of negotiation, or the absence of willingness on the Western part to include Russia in negotiation, is just an incentive for Russia to continue to gain military advantage. That may be territorial advantage, although this is not the main objective. I remind you that the main objective, I mean, the stated objective of the Russians is to destroy the military potential of Ukraine. That was stated by Vladimir Putin on the 24th of February 2022, and that's still the same objective. It sticks to the same, although at the time it was more the destruction of that was demilitarization, basically. So destruction of a potential threat to the population of Donbass. Today it has evolved into the potential threat to Russia, but it's exactly the same objective. It's not the gain of territory, it's a destruction of a potential.
So let me ask you this: let's look at the military aspect of this for a minute. Given that reality, if that's what strategic objectives the Russian side has, that they would like to end the war through negotiations after they have something that they can tangibly hold on to validate their security needs for the future, they're not there yet, and they have been going on the offensive for most of this year. They are opened on the 10th of May, an area north of Kharkiv, but it didn't go very far, and it doesn't look like that's intended to, because they didn't put very many soldiers. I think 14,000 was all they put in there, and there's allegedly a couple of 100,000 more Russian troops in the northern or north of that border in the southern part of Russia that had not yet been engaged. So the question is, what is Russia's play here? Because from one perspective, and a number of military folks I've talked to, it seems like Russia is slow rolling this. Like they're not putting their maximum effort into it, which allows the West to kind of continues helping the Ukraine side linger and hang on. How do you see the military part going, given what you just said about Putin's strategic objectives?
Well, in fact, if you listen, this is exactly what they are doing right now in the north. I mean, the region of Sumy and Kharkov and all that. Basically, what they are trying to do is to establish a buffer zone in order to prevent direct action of artillery against the territory of of Russia in the border area like Belgorod and so on. Basically, that's what they are doing to do. Whether they have the intention to go in a deeper operation and a bigger operation, I have no idea. But at this stage, I think their objective is to have this buffer zone. Now, in terms of understanding the way they are waging war, it's important to come back to what General Surovikin, who was at the time the commander of the forces in Ukraine, and he said on the 18th of October 2022, he said, at this point, that was October again 2022, we don't want to make big operations anymore. We are waiting for the enemy to attack and will destroy systematically the enemy. That's what he said. So the purpose is not to gain territory, is to destroy the enemy. So and that's what the West has not understood, because we tend in the West to associate victory with territorial gain.
Acquisition, yeah.
But again, we are in a Clausewitzian perspective. With the military, the Russian military thinking is based on Clausewitz. And on Clausewitz, the victory is achieved not by gaining territory, but by destroying forces. And that's exactly what the Russians are doing. And that's exactly what we are incentivizing the Russians to do by providing weapons to Ukraine. In fact, we are facilitating, so to say, the Russians to achieve their objective, that means destroying the Ukrainian potential. By the way, remember that in March 2022, as you had this agreement that was agreed upon by the Ukrainian side and by Zelensky, which eventually was withdrawn after the intervention of Boris Johnson. In this agreement, Russia agreed to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. So again, Russia has not as an objective to gain territory. But on the other hand, the realities on the ground today, since the Ukrainians refused the agreement in March 22, there is no way the Russians will come back to that situation. As a result, any discussion that will happen now will base on the real situation on the ground. And the Russians will say, well, we were ready to leave the territory and to give this territory back in March 22. You proposed that, you refused that, so there is no way we are going back to that. Now, this is not Istanbul 2. If there is any negotiation, this negotiation will base on the actual situation that we have today. That's exactly, by the way, what Vladimir Putin is saying. So we missed the opportunity, and that's the reason why when we look at this peace conference, Zelensky is a very bad position, because he knows that he will not be able to achieve any success. And the opportunity he had in March 22 to have a very advantageous solution, he refused that. So he rejected an agreement that was very advantageous for Ukraine. And now his situation has worsened.
Now, let me ask you something. When you were on our show on Thursday of this week, you made a comment that you have some information, or at least you've heard that early in the war, maybe even before the war, that Zelensky was told by certain right-wing figures within his country that if he made a compromise or negotiation with Russia, they could actually take him out. Is that it's still at play with something like this?
Well, apparently it is still so, because we see that Zelensky, in fact, is afraid now to negotiate. And as a matter of fact, he issued a decree that prevents any negotiation with Russia. That was in September 2022, if I'm not wrong. I'm wrong on that, but I think it was September 2022. He issued a decree that prevents even to himself to negotiate with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. Meaning that they set so legal base to prevent any negotiation with Russia, and now they are taken in this kind of trap. They set themselves into a trap, and they are into it now. And the West is playing with that because the aim of the Western countries, even remember that the Prime Minister of Iceland, Estonia, sorry. Iceland is a German word. But Estonia, she said a couple of days ago, she said the aim of this war is to weaken Russia. Again, this is nothing about Ukraine. It's to weaken Russia. As a result, today, this idea that Ukraine cannot negotiate with Russia plays in this scenario, that the idea is to weaken, as you said, to bleed Russia. And but the problem is that Russia is not bleeding, Ukraine is bleeding, and we are now in a situation where Ukraine is trapped in its own trap.
And it's so anguishing, for aside from just the obvious that the primary bill payers are the Ukrainian people, and especially the troops that are being press ganged off the streets. But the irony is that Russia would have been weakened earlier. Let's say that in that Istanbul meeting that you're talking about in March, April of 2022, if we had made an agreement there, Russia probably would have exited weaker than they were when they went in there, and probably would still be weaker today. But because we didn't, now then Russia fully mobilized its industry and is now, bringing in large numbers of troops, more than they lose in combat each month. So they're actually growing stronger and stronger. They're not getting weaker. They're getting stronger.
Absolutely. By the way, this is exactly what happened during World War II with the US. It's because of the war that US became this industrial power that it became in the after wars years, because precisely during the war it was US were the industrial basis for Europe, and we have a similar situation with Russia today. The fact that it is under pressure, and that's why it's interesting to hear some Russian people say they are grateful for the sanctions, because they say without the sanctions we wouldn't have the incentive to develop ourselves, because then the idea would be, the tendency would have been to buy things in the West or in China, but not to develop their own production capability, facilities and capabilities. But by sanctioning Russia, it forced Russia to go back to their own resources and to find solution to the problem. And remember that Russia is one of the countries in the world that produce the most engineers. So the level of education in Russia is extremely high. So if you want to,
and all the natural resources are also off the charts. I mean, they have huge amounts of natural resources.
Well, you have natural resources, you have intellectual resources, you have education resources. I mean, when I was in Moscow in the early 90s, I remember you have taxi drivers who could fluently speak 5 languages and who had a PhD in sociology or things like that, because there were no jobs for them. But that was the early 90s, of course. But meaning that you have a huge potential in terms of resources of all kinds in Russia. Now, the sanctions helped Russia to unleash these resources and to develop themselves. That's exactly what's happening. And today we see that Russia has the biggest growth in the G7 countries. That's become the 4th largest economy
in the world, right?
Economy in the world in terms of purchase parity. But that means that there is no way, if the strategy is still to expect Russia to weaken, it's just hopeless.
We're doing the opposite.
Stupid.
We're the ones who are being weakened. But
yes, in fact, yes, exactly. Because and that's probably, it's probably less in the US than in Europe, but imagine especially Germany, even France, who were hugely dependent on the cheap energy coming from Russia. they are losing. I mean, this is definitely they are losing competitiveness, and that gives way to China. That's why now they have to put tariffs on China. By the way, same thing that is happening in the US, because the industrial capacity has lost competitiveness. And as a result, you have now to put tariffs on China because competitiveness China is stronger. So we are in the snake is eating its own tail, and
Right.
we are exactly in the situation.
It is just so, I keep saying the word ironic, but perverse, just disheartening that while right now there's a peace, so-called, on the title anyway, peace summit, we're actually continuing to lay the foundation for our own weakness and disadvantage while elevating the very so-called enemy that we want to harm. It's just working the opposite direction. And I don't know if we can't recognize it or if we won't recognize it, but it doesn't change the realities that are happening on the ground. And we better change, better open our eyes and change what we're doing pretty quick, or we're going to find ourselves in a world of hurt down the road.
Well, the problem is the childish behavior of our leadership. This is only that, because now they have engaged into a kind of a strategy that doesn't work, but instead of acknowledging that it doesn't work and trying to put the reverse gear, as we know, there is no reverse gear for these guys. As a result, they continue on the way, even knowing that it will go to failure, because they don't want to lose face. And that's probably why the elections that we had in Europe may start to change things, because having new majority, probably new political leadership, this leadership is not liable for the mistakes made by the previous one, and we may have some political change. That's an unknown factor, and as the same as in the US, by the way, with the presidential election. Right. I don't know. I mean, Donald Trump has pledged that he would solve the problem in Ukraine, and probably rightly, because he knows that the situation in Ukraine, especially for the US, because the US has invested a lot of money into that, it's a black hole. Because everything you put into that is lost, period. There is nothing. The material, the equipment that you send, all the investment you make is lost. Probably not of everybody, but for everybody, because we see that a lot of leaders in Ukraine are getting richer, but
some arms manufacturers in the United States are very happy. Yes, of course.
Exactly.
There are some winners, but most of it's losers. Well, listen, Colonel, thank you so much for shining such a bright light on these issues. So no one can claim, and anybody that's watching our show, no one can claim that we didn't know what was coming. We didn't know how this was going to turn out, because you have pulled the curtains back and said, this is actually what's happening on the ground. And almost the only way things are going to work out is in a bad direction for us. And we really appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thank you. That's always a pleasure to have to share some thoughts with you. Thank you.
Always good to have you on. Look forward to having you on the next time. And thank you for joining us again today. Again, we want to invite you to become a member of Daniel Davis Deep Dive, the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army, where you get some special things that you won't get anywhere else, that other people just for watching the show aren't going to get. Exclusive material, back scenes, things that are going on. Some things with Gary. Gary's a great one, and we'll probably a week from today, or a week from yesterday, probably we'll have our next special occasion. So you've got time to sign up and join in that, but you're not going to want to miss it, because there's some really, really great things that you can only get if you're a member of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army. Thanks for joining, and we will see you soon on the Davis Deep Dive.